Hey everyone, just for tuning in. We're just checking up on some technical difficulties. We're going to see once this goes live. Okay, I think we're good to go. Thank you to everyone who's taking a bit of time out of their day to view this presentation. And for those who view this at a later time as well, I hope everyone is safe during these crazy times. Seems like things are slowly starting to unwind a bit, and we're starting to get a clearer lay of the land in all different departments: immigration, health, just generally with work. Um, but the purpose of today is to provide a bit of background on what kind of policy updates we've seen in the immigration space, specifically in Canada, and generally to see where we are today, where we might be in the next few months, and just answering general questions that I've come across through clients and just through other stakeholders in the community. So I wanted to begin by just saying thank you, first and foremost, to the Center for Newcomers, a large settlement organization here in Calgary, Alberta. They invited me to come speak to some of the partnerships and to also other viewers. It's a good opportunity to definitely provide information and just kind of do a little bit of knowledge sharing within the community. Specifically, they also have a program called the Real Me program. I wanted to thank them and their partnership team as well. We do I volunteer with the Real Me program as well, but we also run a legal clinic for vulnerable immigrant youth and their families. And they've been providing a tremendous amount of support in getting this organized. And lastly, I'd like to also thank the various immigration lawyers nationally speaking in Canada. The general public may not know this, but there's a lot of work going on a national level among a lot of more senior lawyers who are really plugged into policy and government in getting some of these policy directions created. And a lot of the positive changes, I think, can definitely be attributed to a lot of these immigration lawyers who are working tirelessly. And I can name a lot of them, and I don't know if they will see this video, but it's definitely worth acknowledging because I think without them, we would not be able to see some of the changes that we've seen, positive changes, as quickly as they've been coming out in the last few weeks. So generally, this is a bit of the agenda for today. I'm going to provide a couple of resources, and I can appreciate that you won't be able to click those links right here. So if you need them, if you can't access the website just based off the URL that I post, by all means you can get in contact with me. I have no problem sending you those links as well. I'm gonna want to talk a little bit about just travel to Canada from the USA, and also just from the rest of the world. It's important, I think, to understand that what's going on with our friends to the south. We do share a border, and there's a lot of movement of people across that border daily. I'm going to then transition into some day-to-day business at the IRCC. What's happening today, how new applications are being handled, what's going on with study permits, what's going on with work permits, just very, very general information. And I'm not really going to get into the mechanics of how to make these applications and whatnot. I think this is just, for the people who are viewing this, it's just more so general knowledge of what's happening. And then also what's going on at the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. So I know a lot of partnerships, for example, with the Center for Newcomers deal with refugee clientele or at-risk individuals who might be kind of, on the fence with their status and might not know what's going on. So I think it's important to understand what's happening there just in terms of daily processing and what we can expect with respect to the applications that are already in process and applications that might be coming in process at a later time. And then lastly, I'll end it with what's going on at the federal court, just real quickly, and then we'll move on to any questions if there are any at the end of this live presentation. So just really quickly about myself, my name is Jatin Shory, in case you missed that. I'm an immigration and refugee lawyer here in Calgary, Alberta, and I work predominantly out of the Northeast, but we handle files all over Alberta and a bit outside of Alberta as well. I focus mostly on appeals and refusals. So what that means is if you've made an application for whatever kind of status in Canada and it's been refused, well, our office likes to handle the appeal side of that as well. We do handle people who are getting deported, so those are detention reviews and admissibility hearings, and a bit of federal court work as well as refugee protection. So the resources, a lot of the information that I'm going to be providing today is online. This is just a more organized approach to it all. But generally, I think some of the more important resources, which are again available online, are speaking to the travel restriction measures and some of the program delivery instructions. And these are the links. You can click on them and you can kind of navigate through the pages and get an understanding. It's pretty well organized. So kudos to IRCC. It's pretty easy to follow and to get a very quick understanding of what's going on and just kind of how to approach any issues that you're facing at all. But otherwise, these links are available, and again, I can send them to you, or you can get in contact with me or my office and just mention you saw the presentation, and again, I can send you these links directly. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about travel to Canada. And I'm sure many of you know by now, but if you're a permanent resident to Canada, or if you're a Canadian citizen, you are allowed entry back into the country, and you have to just follow quarantine rules. And those being you're at home isolated for 14 days. And all of these assessments are, of course, subject to health checks as well. And so what I'm finding from some of my clients who've been coming back in, especially through airports, is that the CBSA officer, the border officer, will actually ask you a number of questions about how are you going to survive for 2 weeks? What's your quarantine plan? They'll do a health check for you right on the spot, and kind of see if you're showing signs of fever or cough or authorization. They can just cross into Canada. And so for most people who are coming to Canada under that situation, they're dealing with a situation where they'll be interpreted as a visitor, and so what that means is that they're coming for an optional or discretionary purpose. So most visitors from the US are just going to be denied entry into Canada. However, if you are allowed into Canada, and there are some exceptions we'll get into, but if you are allowed into Canada, you still have to follow the 14-day quarantine rules. Refugee applicants, up until recently, were being denied from the border, but there's a quick turnaround. And again, I commend the immigration lawyers who worked pretty tirelessly to get that effort across. But now what's happening is that if you are a refugee applicant and you qualify under what's called the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is an agreement between the U.S. and Canada, that typically says that, hey, if you land in the U.S. and you come to Canada to make a refugee claim, you have to first make that claim in the U.S. But there are exceptions to that, and some of those exceptions are if you have family members in Canada who have status or permanent residents or Canadian citizens. So if you have family members, you're typically allowed entry now, and you can make the claim inside Canada. And I'll quickly touch on what's going on with claims when I get to the Refugee Protection Division. But for the most part, it's important to understand that if you have clients who are thinking, well, my family's stuck in the States, I don't know if they can come, they might get trouble at the border, or they might get turned away, or what might happen. Well, no, if they come to Canada, if they come to the Canadian border and say, I'm here to make a refugee claim, I have my brother, my sister, my mother, whoever in Canada, and they're on valid status, then they'll be allowed entry to make that claim. So as I mentioned earlier, generally speaking, foreign nationals are not allowed entry into Canada. But if you're a worker, if you're a study permit holder, you are. And so I put it in the slide speaking to the rest of the world. But generally speaking, if you have a study permit, and I'll get to a certain exception around that, but if you have a study permit or a work permit, you're very likely allowed into the country, and even having confirmation of that study permit or work permit is good enough. But what's important is that for study permits, if it was approved after March 18th, you won't be allowed in. So that's the only condition for study permits. Super visa holders, if you have clients who have family abroad who hold visas, well, they're just not going to be allowed on the plane or allowed to cross in the border into Canada right now, unless they fall under certain exceptions. But generally speaking, this is considered optional or discretionary travel. That there's an example that I put here of where maybe both parents hold open work permits or some kind of status and their child has a visitor visa. Well, you can get written authorization from Immigration, Refugee Citizenship Canada that basically allows that child to travel with the parents to come to Canada. And I will talk about quickly how to make that request. So it's important to understand that the travel for optional discretionary purpose is not allowed, and unfortunately there hasn't been a black and white criteria of what qualifies as that, and so we're finding that a lot of border officers are having discretion on how they want to assess a person's reasons for coming to Canada. There's a couple news articles actually going around right now speaking to this issue, that especially in situations where we have spouses or partners of Canadian citizens or permanent residents not being allowed into the country. And the CBSA has taken a position, I don't know if it's changed yet, but the last I saw about a couple of days ago, they've taken the position that if your spouse is abroad, then they're coming here for an optional or discretionary purpose. And lawyers are making arguments that this is family reunification, that this shouldn't be happening. So it's important to understand that if you have a client or what have you in that kind of situation, then you should still fight for it, and there are ways to submit packages in advance to try and get those written authorizations, especially from IRCC, so that they don't face these kinds of troubles when they're transiting into Canada. So what I did here was there are a number of exceptions to foreign nationals who might initially be barred from coming into Canada, but I haven't listed all of them, but I've listed the ones that I think apply generally, and I guess most apply compared to some other exceptions. But the one of them being the immediate family member of a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. So an immediate family member is defined, and I'll just show it later. But basically, it's your parent or grandparent, your spouse or common law partner, or your children or your spouse's children. And if you fall into one of those categories, then you can get written authorization to travel back to Canada. The other category of individuals is work permit holders and study permit holders. And again, if you have a valid work permit or study permit, you'll be allowed in. But the study permit, the one condition is that study permit should have been granted before March 18th. However, if you have a confirmation letter that you've been granted the status, you just haven't come to Canada yet, well, again, if that confirmation letter is before March 18th, you should be fine. And if for the work permits, if you have that confirmation letter, you can use that to come to Canada. They're accepting the letters even if you don't have the visa in hand yet. Usually it's printed out at the airport. Otherwise some of the other exceptions relate. And so what was happening at the beginning was that the most part family reunification where they can, the quarantine rules. And so it's just something we have to, I think, get used to for the time being. So if you're a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident stuck abroad, I recommend going to travel.gc.ca. There's a lot of guidance and a lot of information that will help you navigate in terms of how to get in touch with the consulate, the local consulate, and how to get in touch with IRCC. You can register yourself as somebody abroad, and you can and that may help put your name on the government's radar in terms of any travel plans or any arrangements that they're making for moving any Canadian citizens or permanent residents still stuck abroad back to Canada. So it's a good resource, and I highly recommend directing your clients to this website. I have, for sure, and sometimes that's enough for them to kind of figure out what to do next. So with international students in Canada right now, I mean, there was a lot of confusion. A lot of things were changing. Courses were going online. People's study permits were expiring, and they anticipated finishing class but then couldn't. So the first and foremost, if you have status in Canada, temporary status in Canada, if you're an international student or a worker, or even a visitor, if you're still here, you have to extend your application. If you're coming to that point, and extending your status is really important. If you're a worker, for example, and you're an employer-specific work permit, you're stuck to a certain employer, and they haven't undergone the process of getting new LMIA or extending your work permit, or you can't find a new employer, you should at least change your status to a visitor for the time being so that you do have some status here. And even then, I mean, will it be processed in the normal regular processing times? We don't know, but at least you maintain implied status. So what that means is from the day you submit your application, as long as it is before your status expired, well, until the time that decision is made, you can stay in Canada on what's called implied status. So it's a huge tool in terms of maintaining status and not running into any immigration problems at a later time. Again, as I mentioned before, if you got your study permit before March 18th and you're still trying to come to Canada, you can come here. But one important change in the landscape of education is that things are going online. So typically international students would study here, then go for a work permit, and then eventually go for permanent residency. So there was a fear that because one of the requirements for that for your study and to qualify for a work permit is that you attended in person and you were attending full-time studies. Well, the government announced that if you have converted to online classes, you're completely fine. This will not impact your ability to apply for a post-grad work permit. So that's one, I think, big concern that's at least been alleviated for the time being. So for temporary foreign workers, I just wanted to talk really quickly about a new policy that came out yesterday. And this is a program, they've labeled it the public policy on exemption to work permit conditions when changing employment. So of course, I mean, a lot of people have been losing work over the last few months, and a lot of temporary foreign workers have been part of this category. So the government announced that if you have an employer specific work permit, so you have a work permit that says you can only work for this company. Well, if you manage to, if you're laid off, for example, and you manage to find a new employer who has a job offer that's backed by what's called a labor market impact assessment, you have a job offer, well, you can actually submit a work permit application and begin working right away for that employer. Well, what happened in the past is that, like I mentioned, that implied status scenario, well, when somebody would start working for a new company, sometimes they could continue working for that old company. And the rules originally said that if you apply for that extension or that change of conditions or working for a new employer, well, you have implied status, you can still stay, but you can only work based on conditions of that old work permit. Well, now the government's saying, listen, if you have a new employer, they followed the rules and they got the permits, and you apply for a work permit now based on that, well, you can start working right away before that decision is issued. And I think this is a way of just, helping those, because typically this program could take 2 months, 3 months for you to get a work permit, the original system. So this is a way of kind of filling in that gap, and I mean, it's welcomed by all immigration lawyers, by all temporary foreign workers. I think it's a great initiative, and it's a good way of filling in the gap for those who are now facing situations where they didn't expect to lose their jobs. One of the questions is, will this apply to nannies or caregivers or anything along those lines? We don't know yet, but it seems like, nothing has indicated that it won't. So it seems pretty black and white based on the conditions of what's going on right now. So what's going on at the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada? So the Immigration and Refugee Board is a tribunal. It's basically where I do a lot of my work in immigration litigation, but there are a number of divisions. There's the Immigration Appeal Division, the Immigration Division, and then the Refugee Protection Division, and with it, the Refugee Appeal Division, where you appeal your negative refugee claims. But generally, the Immigration Appeal Division handles a lot of matters like spousal sponsorship refusals and those who lose PR because they weren't in Canada for enough time, or people who have removal orders issued against them. Well, for now, all of this is being postponed as we can expect, but all hearings are being postponed, all in-person hearings are being postponed. But that being said, you can still make new applications, and these are being accepted by way of email, and a lot of communication now is just transferred over to email. It sounds like the IAD recently restaffed or started staffing their offices again, and they're starting to issue decisions again, which typically means that they're transitioning back towards eventually rescheduling, because a lot of the hearings that were in that time period between the last 2 months got pushed. So it seems like they're starting to move back towards actually hiring staff and kind of going back to business as usual. So the immigration division is where they do detention reviews mostly and admissibility hearings, and so people who are detained by CBSA go through a process of detention reviews. It's like immigration's bail system, and you're supposed to get a review within 48 hours. But what we're finding is that those who are not as high risk, those who maybe have good support in the city, are actually being released on conditions pretty early on. There's really those complicated files where the minister is still fighting for detention. These are being heard by teleconference, from what it sounds like, and they're still following the statutory timelines for when they need to be heard. So the Refugee Protection Division, as you can imagine, handles refugee matters. So typically what happens is when you're making a claim, there's a whole process of filling a bunch of forms, submitting those forms, and then going through an intake interview. And then after the interview is completed, you're basically put into the system if it's accepted, waiting for your hearing to be scheduled. What's happening right now is that all the intake interviews have been postponed. They're not even scheduling new ones at the moment. And it seems like any new decisions or any people waiting on decisions, well, those are also being temporarily suspended because there's just no staff in the office to undergo the procedure required to actually issue those decisions. So writing the decision is the only part. I guess they have some internal procedures as well, but they just can't follow it right now because there aren't any staff present. I mean, that may have changed. The last I heard about this was maybe earlier this week. But generally speaking, all deadlines for submitting forms, etc., everything has been postponed. This is both at the Refugee Appeal Division and the Refugee Protection Division. So typically when you get a negative decision, you have 30 days to file, 30 days to basically give your evidence and your arguments and notify the Refugee Appeal Division that you want to head in this direction. So all of that has been suspended. I mean, you should still be notifying the Refugee Appeal Division, especially. I think it's within 15 days. You should still be notifying them that you intend to appeal, but your documents won't be due for quite some time. You can let them know you need an extension. It's very common. I haven't seen any extension requests get denied yet. So it's kind of the end of my presentation here. So what's happening at the Federal Court of Canada? The Federal Court is a place that you go to if you can't go to the Immigration Refugee Board. Or if you have no way of your file or matter can't go to the Immigration and Refugee Board. And so the federal court, if the matter is heard in Canada, you usually have 15 days to file. And if it's a matter that was decided overseas, then you have 60 days to file. But those timelines, again, have been suspended. And it seems like this blackout period will continue until the end of June, from what we've heard. It says May 29th, but I know it's been pushed to June as well. All hearings have been postponed past, we'll probably start getting rescheduled after June as well. But generally speaking, I mean, the federal court is still accessible. You can still file. All filing fees have been waived for now, so it's a good time to file if you have a matter that you think might be going there, because you won't have to pay for the $50. But generally speaking, things aren't moving that quickly. All timelines have been suspended. If you have things due that fall within that blackout period, then what's going to happen is once the blackout period ends, your time will start counting from that day forward. Some information to keep in mind if you find yourself headed in that direction. So this is the conclusion of my presentation. I don't see any questions right now, which is fine. You know, if you come to the end of this after this live video and you do have questions, my information is right there. Feel free to connect with me on via email. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Otherwise, I look forward to doing a couple more of these kinds of seminars. Maybe on COVID-19, might be on other topics you might have an interest in, but really just utilizing our YouTube page a little bit more, especially at a time when everything is transitioning to the space anyways. But thank you again. I appreciate your time coming to the end here, and looking forward to the next one. Thanks.